Okay, listen up. So, forestry products, primarily timber, is cut wood that you bring out of the forest. There's many things that they have been used for many years. Lumber and shelter in general has been an application, of course, for tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years. Not quite as old, but still used quite a bit as paper. And by the way, these are not in order of volume of use. I'm not sure what it is. I would imagine paper's way up there, but lumber is as well. But also fuel. It's still a major source of heat for many parts of the world. As we know, the developing nations are outnumber the developed nations, and it is still a common source of heat for cooking and heating in those applications as well. It is biological, therefore it is renewable. Okay? So let's remember the concept of renewable resources in that it's like a bank account. Nature has started us off already with a balance, with a certain amount in the bank, so to speak. And we make withdrawals from it when we harvest from it. But then it has a natural process. Renewable resources have to have a natural process that makes deposits back into the account. That's the renewable part of it. And biological resources have the process of what? What is it that populations do so that they will continue to have members of that population? Yeah, reproduce, exactly. So so that's important to understand and remember, because on this and with fish and other biological resource, the key is to encourage reproduction and make sure that they keep the species line going and doing certain things as far as harvesting that will help to ensure that. So we have certain types of practices that can be used in forests that will help it to make sure that the withdrawals do not exceed the deposits, so to speak. And that's what we call sustainable use. Whenever you have a renewable resource, whether it's this or water or soil or anything else that has a renewing process, sustainable techniques make sure that the withdrawals are not greater than the deposits. Okay, so you want to cut selectively, and one of the guidelines that you can follow is the guidelines that we see in succession. If you remember way back when we studied that, we talked about the fact that it is natural to have certain parts of your forest populations be cut down by forest fires and termites and winds and things like that. They tend to affect more the older trees that have started to rot and things than the younger group, and therefore they're in a way making sure you maintain pre- or reproductive age members. So as you might imagine, that's going to be necessary to keep the population going, is trees that are actively producing seeds. And all organisms have certain prime reproductive ages. And therefore we can use that knowledge of that particular age, and there are things like that to keep the population going. The other main thing you need to preserve in this, in case just not only for the trees but for the environment in general, is soil. So we've already mentioned the fact when we talked about soil resources before, that trees help to maintain the soil, keep it in place. Their root structure keeps it in place, as well as their vertical structure acts as a windbreak and keeps the wind erosion down in those areas. So if you go in and clear cut a forest, not only are you removing members of that population that could make seeds and regenerate that population, you're also opening it up for extensive soil erosion. And of course, when that happens, then you're not going to get regrowth. Even if seeds are blown in by the wind and stuff after you clear cut it, or carried there by animals, without soil to root into, they're not going to germinate, or they're not going to germinate for a long time until the soil is regenerated. So that's important as well, of course. So clear cutting is the unsustainable way to do it. It is, of course, the most convenient and easy to do. It is controlled in most of your developing nations, like a lot of things that we talk about, but also in developed nations, industrialized nations. Most of them have started projects to preserve these or make sure that you do your forestry management in a controlled way. But of course, in the developing world, where they don't have the money and resources, that's not as common. Most of, at least in the United States, most of the timber, the commercial timber that is harvested, is actually harvested from public lands. You might think that's terrible. They're going to the state forest and cutting trees down and things like that. But it's a matter of being able to regulate what's done. They are permitted, they're inspected, observed, and everything like that. And also means that the state is still, or the country still maintains ownership, and at any given time they can say, all right, no more, we can't log here and everything anymore. If, on the other hand, the forest companies and stuff like that bought up private land, they could do pretty much all they wanted to on it, and therefore would not be sustainable. And of course, your timber companies, like Alcoa, for example, is one of the bigger ones. They, not Al-Qaeda, Alcoa, is, you know, they have a vested interest. They want to keep their corporation and everything going year after year, and the only way they can do that is with sustainable forestry. Whereas in a developing nation, you might imagine people are more willing to say, all right, we're going to get whatever we can out of it, because it's oftentimes represents in an acre enough valuable timber to basically be a year's worth of salary for some people. So the temptation is much greater to do that.
What is that first word?
Lumber. Okay, lumber, paper, and fuel. Fuel being burning it, right? And there, as we'll see in energy resources, they're actually making high-tech wood-burning electrical power generators because of the fact that it is a renewable resource and you can utilize it sustainably, but it's not easy. All right, so seafood is also another biological resource. We do get it from the ocean, yes. So I'm going to go ahead and give you credit for that.
666.
I hear you. I guess the group 6 doesn't get it then, so I'll have to wait until I have a group 666. We still get it from the wild. Okay, we don't. Most people are not eating venison every night for dinner, or harvesting other kinds of things from the wild. Most of our stuff comes from the farm. This is true not just in developed countries. Also, it's unless you're a hunter-gatherer, you are typically using agriculture to raise your food. But a lot of most of the fish that is consumed around the world does come from the wild, and the fish is actually the predominant fish or is the predominant meat type food around the world as well. I know it's not so much here in the United States, but in a lot of other nations it is. And for a while, biologists, even conservation biologists, up until about the 1950s, when they really started noticing things were going wrong, thought that fish ecosystems, marine populations, were inexhaustible. That there were so many of them, they're so vast, the balance in the bank was so great, and the rate at which people could take fish was small enough that it was inconceivable, really, to them that they could have a damage on the population. But technology overtook that. And you had a period in World War II when you're done with a major war, a worldwide war like that, you develop all kinds of machinery and things. So they had big boats and things like that no longer needed to be used for the military, or the engines from those boats and things like that they could build huge vessels. Ironically, a big jump in commercial fishing came after they banned whaling, because you had these companies that fished for whales, or whaled, I guess would be the proper term for that, and they could no longer do that, so they converted over these huge ships for fishing purposes. So we were able to take a lot more out of the ocean than we did before because of technology, and also, of course, the growing population has put more of a demand on everything as well. So consequently, you've got many ecosystems, marine populations of fish that they're just barely at the sustainability level. If they exceed their replacement fertility, just like in human populations, the population is going to start to decrease. The withdrawals are exceeding the deposits in that case. So there's certain habits that are particularly important for fishing. Now, one of the problems, of course, is just the total population, a lot of these, but you have other problems that occur because of types of fishing techniques. One fishing technique is called, let me put this in there, make sure you write this in your notes, I've got to put this in, bottom trawling. Because trawling in general just means basically pulling your line or pulling your bait with you as you go along and fish, rather than staying in one place. Bottom trawling involves, as the name implies, using a very big, heavy, basically they call it a sled. It's just basically a big piece of metal, maybe like half the size of this room and several tons in mass. and they sink it to the bottom, and they collect a net to it that comes all the way up to the surface and drag it along, and basically are able to collect everything in that water column there. So it brings in a lot of catch, but also it completely messes up the, I'll take marine, it should be more specific, but I'll go ahead and take it, benthic habitats. So do I remember what benthic is? When we did marine biome stuff, what is it?
Is that what are the word I'm looking for? At the bottom.
Yes, very good. Bottom
This is at
benthic,
the bottom.
BB. So it's your benthic organisms, those that stay on the bottom, and part of it is so you can harvest those as well. Not just clams and oysters and stuff, but there's a lot of fish like halibut, your flatfish and everything that stay on the bottom for the most part, and therefore they want to drag along that. But of course, it completely destroys the physical structure and everything, and wrecks reefs and all kinds of bad stuff. So it's a very not only large volume type method for taking fish, which means you're going to have a large decrease in numbers, but it destroys these benthic habitats, which is also very bad. Net techniques in general tend to have more, off, that's what good. I'll give that, the technical term is non-target. Tend to collect a lot of the fish that you're not trying to catch. They're not edible, or they're not supposed to be caught. They're regulated because they're endangered. And ones of particular concern are those things that are not actually fish, but that are reptiles or mammals, like turtles and dolphins, because of course, since they have to breathe air, they're particularly susceptible to dying in the nets as they're being pulled in because being held underwater for too long. There was a time, I guess it's no longer considered to be a problem so much, but there was a time when your bigger tuna companies like Starkist and those would label their, maybe they still do, I don't know, they would label their cans dolphin free, which didn't mean you weren't getting dolphin in your tuna. I kind of like a little dolphin in my tuna personally, but it meant that the fishing methods they employed or the areas that they caught the fish in were specifically done to limit this kind of bycatch, to limit getting dolphins in their nets and stuff, because it had been a real problem in the past before they became more aware of it. So that's some other things that you can do. One of the things that is necessary, remember one of the goals we have when we are preserving a biological resource is to ensure that you've got reproductive age populations, ones that are in that. And using size limits, reproductive, is the best way to do that when it comes to fish. So the reason why they have rules, and those of you who fish know that they'll, for certain species and stuff, they'll say it has to be a minimum length and things like that. That is to avoid taking younger or reproductive age fish out of the population. As a matter of fact, with both this and with forestry and really any kind of biological resource, if you take the older post-reproductive organisms out of the population, in a way you are helping that population. Because those older ones, we're no longer any good if we're not making babies anymore. We're just taking up resources and not helping the population out any. So removal of those organisms can actually free up enough resources that it better ensures that population is going to bounce back. So it's kind of like with the succession, the reset succession I said, where the forest fires came in, they would kill off the old things that were soaking up and blocking the sunlight, soaking up all the nutrients and stuff, and now new plants and stuff can grow up in their place. Same thing with the trees here, and same thing with these fish if you take the older members of the population. Also using line techniques as opposed to net techniques, so it's going to reduce your bycatch. And then of course in general, catch limits. You can only take certain numbers of species. So with both these particular resources, a lot has to do with regulations being established, limits being put, permits being required, all those kind of legal things that go on. And you have to realize that whenever populations depend on that, that means that also you're going to have to, whenever you set regulations, you have to have enforcement. So that means all the kinds of things. You got to catch the people doing it. Once they're caught, you have to go through court systems and all that kind of things. And therefore it can make things kind of difficult to regulate and make sure that you have a good supply and you don't experience a tragedy of the commons. Any questions? Forests and fish. Okay? All right, finally, mineral resources. Renewable or non-renewable?
No.
How many people think non? Oh, all right. I mean, any renewables out there?
You didn't.
All right, we got one or two. All right, these are non-renewables. First time we talked about something non-renewable. Basically, anything you're getting from the crust of the earth is considered a mineral resource. You do have to get down beneath the soil. Soil is a renewable resource, but stuff from underneath that, your metals, non-metals, fossil fuels, etc., anything you dig out of the ground basically is a mineral resource. The big things about non-renewable resources, one thing is we don't typically share them with the rest of the environment, so we don't have an issue there. They're not a biological organism, so we're not depleting a species. You don't have squirrels that depend upon their gold supply to survive, so that's not an issue. But the practice of extracting, of getting that out of mining, has a lot of environmental impacts. Most of your mines are surface or strip mines. We know we have this kind of idea of mines being a mine shaft, and going down in little carts and stuff and getting lost in there. And of course you hear the news stories about those that collapse, very horrible stories, and people trapped in there. But most of your mines are not like that. Most of your mines are big holes in the ground and they're all opened up. It's a lot easier to do it that way. So that, of course, is complete habitat destruction. And wherever we have habitat destruction and deforestation, we're going to have soil erosion. And it's not like you can clear it and then plant something else in its place. As long as that mine is open, you're going to have totally exposed soil all the time. This is basically what you do in mining. You expose soil and then expose bedrock and things like that. So because you've done that, not only is it soil erosion, wind and water, that means that sand and the dust is going to get into the air and there can be air pollution. It's going to run off in the water and be water pollution. You're also digging up stuff from the crust of the earth that's not supposed to be on the surface in the first place. Things like arsenic and lead and mercury, toxic substances that are now exposed, and the wind's going to blow them out and all over the place, and they're going to get into the ecosystem or into humans that way. And the water, the runoff from them, is going to wash them out and take them into lakes and ponds and streams as well as the aquifer, both of which are bad. And then you have another issue that comes up with sulfur. Now, sulfur is not technically a toxic substance. I wouldn't want to eat a pound of it, but you take it in your diet in many different ways. But the sulfur, there's always a lot of sulfur in the crust of the earth, no matter what you dig up. And sulfur is an element that is used by a lot of bacteria as its electron acceptor. But that's not important if you don't understand now. They just use a part of their metabolism, and their byproducts from that is sulfuric acid. So you end up with something called acid mine drainage because of that. So the water that's running off from these mines is also acidic. And as I've told you, acids dissolve minerals, so these toxic things are going to be more soluble, therefore be able to carry farther. It also means, as we discussed, just like with acid precipitation, that runoff is going to demineralize the soil as it goes down. And then finally, that runoff is going to end up in lakes and ponds and groundwater and stuff like that, carrying all those pollutants with it. So you get a lot of impact from doing that. Okay. So mining, like I said, the resource is not something that we're stealing away from other organisms in the environment, but it has huge environmental impacts where it is found. Fortunately, they're not, you usually don't have 10 mines in a town or something like that. They're usually pretty far spaced apart. But in those areas where you find them, there's a lot of ecological damage. And here's the other thing about mining and all non-renewable resources is the fact that they're going to be depleted. That's why they're non-renewable. Which means that now you're going to have to leave that mine and go somewhere else on Earth and find another source of it if you're going to stay in business. So now you've got even more impact as you go from one place to the next. And that's one of the big problems with non-renewable resources. Okay. Another thing as well is particularly with metal resources, that refinement and oil or petroleum or fossil fuel resources, that when you refine them, that requires a lot of times large amounts of energy. So that's an impact. And create a lot of air and water pollution in the process of refining them. Okay? So what's the main thing that we can do? You can't really preserve a non-renewable resource in that and because it's not getting replenished. You can preserve it, I should say that. You can preserve it, but you can't make it so that you get more of it if you just control the usage of it. So what you can do is reduce how much of it you use. And then you can reuse some of the materials so that you don't have to buy new ones. And then you can recycle. Okay, so I want to make sure you remember that 3 R's thing. You should have all heard this before. This is the ones that's what's on the triangle. That's why it's a triangle and it represents recycling. Right, there you go. But I want you to remember that order because those are actually in order of what's best for the environment. Reducing your use of a particular substance is always best for the environment. Okay, because it's not made by somebody else somewhere at any point in time. Recycling or reuse, excuse me, is good as well because that means you're not whatever you're reusing it for, you're not going to buy something else to replace that. So that's of course less resource usage then. And then with recycling, recycling's good, but it's not as good as the other two because when you recycle, to truly be recycling, you have to break that product down and then reform it into a new product. And that always takes energy to do that. So there's environmental impact there. Using alternative materials, ones perhaps that are renewable, like wood instead of metal, or sometimes using clay. Now clay's not renewable, but you find it in much greater parts. So ceramics are becoming our area of technology that's being used to do that. And then, as I mentioned, when you're done with your mining, you're going to have to pack up and go somewhere else. And therefore, there's legislation now in the United States and many parts of the developed world where when you do that, you have to reclaim that area, you have to replace the soil, you have to plant trees and whatever was there before you left, or before you started, excuse me. So that's reclamation mined areas as a requirement in that case as well. Any questions about forest, fish, and mining resources? Yes, Mr. Brundage.
Do you believe in wizards?